You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're diving deep into one of the most comprehensive studies on university intellectual property commercialization ever undertaken. Our guests today are Dr. Todd Davey and Medisa Focic, the lead authors of Unlocking University IP, Global Insights into Commercialization Challenges and Opportunities, a groundbreaking UIIN Insights Brief that examines IP and commercialization frameworks across 5 global regions. Todd brings exceptional expertise to today's discussion. He is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Institut Mines-Télécom Business School in Paris and serves as associate partner at the University Industry Innovation Network, also known as UIIN. Todd is a passionate educator, researcher, and recognized international expert in entrepreneurship, innovation, and university business collaboration. With over 15 years of experience spanning academia and industry, Todd previously served as a senior manager with Deloitte Australia's Technology Commercialization Group and was part of the executive team for one of Australia's fastest growing startups in the 2000s. He holds a PhD in entrepreneurship at universities from VU University Amsterdam and is the author of Entrepreneurship at Universities and co-editor of the Future Universities Thought Book. Todd also created Tech Advance, a tool for evaluating technologies. His research has been published extensively, and he maintains visiting academic positions at Imperial College London, Technical University of Vienna, and the University of Adelaide. Joining Todd is Medisa Focic, a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney, whose research focuses on intellectual property policies and IP management in European universities. Her doctoral work explores how universities adapt their IP policies, examining the influence of macro-level regulations and the management strategies they employ. Medisa's research delves into the academic culture around IP, commercialization and valorisation pathways, and internal-external influences dynamics, while identifying current trends in practice and recommendations for the future. As project coordinator and research officer at ICKR EU, she brings both theoretical knowledge and practical experience to understanding the complexities of university IP management. Welcome to the podcast, Todd and Medisa. Really excited to have you here on the air.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for inviting us. We're really looking forward to the next hour, having the discussion with you and discussing our work.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for having us on the podcast. We're looking forward to the fruitful discussion on the IP commercialization policies and processes for universities.
Yeah, and let's get into it because there's a lot to discuss. And first of all, congratulations. Really, what a great insights brief and what tremendous work the two of you have put into this. So let's talk about the report. And first of all, it covers 5 global regions, and it truly presents a comprehensive view of university IP commercialization. So talk to us a little bit about what motivated the two of you to undertake such an ambitious comparative study, and what were you hoping to discover?
Well, the intellectual property at universities as a topic, we found remains undiscovered a resource of interesting insights that can be useful for the future. And I would say sustainability for universities. Both me and Todd are interested in this through my PhD research studies, but also through our everyday work that is focused a lot on innovation outputs, entrepreneurial university business collaboration, research valorization, and commercialization, and other topics that are closely related to intellectual property as well. And we saw that IP policies are untapped and sleeping topic, I would say, and that there is missing comparative analysis across regions. And there is no, I would say, maybe holistic approach taken before to understand this topic in more broader sense. We wanted to discover why IP policies are important for universities, what is their role, how they are being defined, and what is their purpose in the terms of the commercialization processes, but not just that. Across regions, we wanted to map good practices and to, provide maybe some actionable recommendations that can be useful for nations, but also universities and individuals themselves.
And maybe if I could just add to that, I guess we believe very strongly in evidence-based research as a driver for both education as well as innovation. And I think based upon this knowledge gap that we saw, we really wanted to make a strong statement. I think it's fair to say that we are acknowledging as well that there's a high degree of complexity even within the continents or the regions that we analysed. So what I mean by that is that there's quite a range of differences between countries, for example, in Africa or South America, but even within Europe and just even some of the states in the US. So just to acknowledge that as well.
So one of the things I really found interesting about your report was that one of your key findings is that despite widespread belief in the potential of university IP, commercialization outcomes, they remain stubbornly low globally. So help our listeners understand why this persistent gap exists between potential and reality.
Yeah, look, it was a key finding, and to some degree, it's a disappointment that we both had, was that this gap remains and that the contribution of universities is not being fully realised. I guess starting at the bottom, just not having IP policies at all, or if they're badly constructed. So, for example, in developing countries, the lack of existence or recognition of IP policies can be a real issue. But even in Europe, I mean, this is something that Medisa is doing part of her PhD, is she identified the different layers that exist. So between, the IP law at a European level, national level, and even a regional and institutional level, it just creates this level of complexity, which either makes it difficult to navigate, or the fact that it's, there could even be conflicting IP policies that I guess they're overlapping on the same sort of topic. I think another thing that we noticed or identified was that the lack of an office or personnel responsible. Now, again, we're talking at a real base level approach to knowledge transfer and commercialization. Having an office or personnel significantly increases the likelihood that you're going to get an impact from research. But I think also it's just recognizing that blue sky research still needs a lot of development. It could be up to 25 years of work that needs to be done on from a research project when it first starts to the point where you actually get something out into the market. So from that perspective, I mean, that obviously goes back to the reference to the valley of death and the inability for universities to cross that. I think there are some universities doing some really interesting things to address that, but at the same time, I think just generally that is a phenomenon that we identified. I think one of the things that we've noticed as well is that there's been some realization at the highest level of universities that there is there's money involved in this. There's a form of potentially a source of revenue. And when you look at the statistics, what we found was that in 1991 in the US there was 130 million US worth of licensing revenue. And then by 2015, there were 2.4 billion. And so obviously, if you hear that as a leader of a university, you think, oh, wow, there's money to be made here. But when you drill down into it, what we see really clearly is that 15 universities account for 70% of this income, and usually they're elite universities. So I guess there's that. And also just maybe to add, the research that we've done in Europe has identified that, under 1% of academics exclusively do spinouts or licenses, when in fact most of those that do any form of spin out or license also collaborate quite extensively with industry and government. And so from that perspective, just understanding that those that are engaging in spin outs and the licensing of intellectual property as an academic, they're likely to be collaborators, and maybe that's something that TTOs should keep in mind.
Yeah, maybe something that I would add besides these incentives, misalignments, infrastructure and cultural things that Todd mentioned is that getting to such conclusions also made us think what are the outcomes and how we should look upon measuring the outcomes in the future, because obviously they are not satisfying for many universities, and we have to rethink maybe the role of the universities in the future. And of course, there also comes the question of what is the role of university, and should the university be focused on outcomes or impact? And the next question also relates to it. Maybe something else that I would also add is that even though the statistics are disappointing, I would say that universities all around the world are really in the last 20 years doing a great job. And as one of the conclusions in our report says, we shouldn't measure the success only by the number of the patents or the spinouts, licenses and royalties, but also by the number of the maybe staff we employed, initiatives we started to make IP visible at the institutional level and across regions. And actually, our report shows that there are a lot of positive stories to this topic that deserve a highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something I noticed in your report. You emphasized, some of the social impacts being made by various tech transfer offices in various parts in the world. And in those countries, that was really key and very, very important for the local ecosystem there. So, and that's what's so neat about your report is it's really the first in-depth comparative study of kind of IP commercialization around the world. So there were some really fascinating findings that you made. And, I think one of the things that I found fascinating was you talk about the distinctly different approaches across regions. And so I thought maybe, Todd, if you could walk us through the North American model, because really kind of Bayh-Dole kind of started all this. So it's been very influential in the US, has made a huge difference here. Talk about how it's been adapted or maybe rejected in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, look, I think Bayh-Dole is obviously the preeminent IP policy framework that has been created globally. And obviously, when it was created as well, it started to change the thinking around research at universities. By making research almost a commercial property that the university would manage, then it gave the incentive for universities to do exactly that, to create offices that can manage that. And, TTOs are the classic office structure that's been chosen. And I guess these sort of constructs have been really important, as we've mentioned previously, as we saw in the report. They have made a significant difference. I think when it comes to applying that globally, it's obviously far more complex. We're talking about a common law environment as opposed to, for example, in Europe, there's civil law, and so that tends to lead to quite difficult moments, I guess, to when it comes to applying intellectual property law from one context to the next, because in Europe, you might have, quite detailed and comprehensive laws and rules, which you then have to navigate through. At the same time, you might have this overarching intellectual property law, and it might conflict against some of these other laws. So I guess, as much as anything, I think there's been a desire globally from what we've seen to apply something similar. I've heard it when I've gone to, whether it's South America or it's Africa, continually that gets brought up as, the example that they're looking at. But at the same time, their ability to actually implement that is I guess, a lot more difficult because of the local laws and the local context that they have. I think there's also, it's fair to say in Europe, there's also a recognition of professors' privilege. So that's something that is taken quite seriously in Europe. So that also limits the ability to sort of impose this construct, this US construct onto European universities. But perhaps just to summarize, I think it has given universities globally an example that they can refer to. And I think what they've done is to take bits of it or to customize it to their purpose as much as their local laws and their university philosophy allows.
So, Todd, you talked about Europe, and I want to keep on that theme here for a second. So, Medisa, the European approach emphasizes valorization rather than pure commercialization. Can you explain this concept and how it differs from more than the traditional IP-driven models that we've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, definitely. Well, valorization, as the term itself says, is focused on the value, but in terms of the value, it takes a diversified approach where the value can take different forms and can be observed at different levels, individual, institutional, societal, and even global level. So in terms of the valorization, it isn't focused only on market results or commercialization values being derived from the, let's say, intellectual property. And it also looks at intellectual property as a tool, but not as a mean towards the end. So basically, protecting the IP is just one of the forms of the valorization. I would say valorization also is good for measuring the social impact and qualitative impacts as well. Some things maybe that cannot be measured in a way of numbers, but still has a profound impact on different levels, as I have mentioned. And in terms of the forms, as I said, it doesn't only focus on classical technology transfer forms like patents, spinouts, licensing, and so on, but it can be anything that academics, let's say, or university staff do, such as the policy advice, education consultancy, anything that has a connection with cultural, social impact, and so on. And this concept have been popularized around Europe, but also historically it has been present in some societies, and we did quite a lot of projects on this topic as well. It definitely differs from classical commercialization pathway took in the Bayh-Dole Act approach, and it's gaining momentum, I would say, more and more now across the Europe, specifically because, as I have said, we see that there is a lot of impact that actually doesn't have proper measurement approach, and a lot of outputs are being missed out of the context or a broader picture. And valorization as a tool can maybe help us redefine some of these things. And maybe just the final thought, valorization as an alternative term to commercialization is also language preference, I would say, maybe when you speak with academics, because they might be sensitive about the language that you use and the way how you see their work. Many of them, are rather focused on the broader impact than something that is measured through the currency or the money university gains out of classical commercialization.
And maybe if I could just add to that, I think what you'll hear from us quite consistently is when we talk about intellectual property, we also talk about the context, and I think you can't separate the two. Because they're intimately tied. And I think that's one thing I've noticed when I came to Europe was this much greater focus on societal good. And there's been a long history, actually, of North and Western European countries, or universities in this case, collaborating quite extensively through joint R&D and consulting. So quite established relationships with industry, and so there's this long history of having this collaboration. I guess that also flavors the environment in which the intellectual property laws are brought into being. And I think also in Europe there's increasingly a desire to make sure that social sciences and humanities are not left out. I mean, STEM tends to be the focus for commercialization activities, the type of work that's been done and the way it then can be protected is different, obviously, to social science and humanities. And I think there's a real focus in Europe to want to find ways and creative ways, so social impact to be created from those research projects.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, to your point, Todd, in both Europe and Canada, where a real emphasis is placed as well on social innovations, where, in fact, I know in Canada, there are some social impact or social innovation accelerators where they are focused on the kind of getting out and making an impact with some of those innovations that are not STEM related. And some of the universities in Canada have had great success with those. So that's something that's finally starting to take root here in the US. But yeah, that is something that I have noticed in the years I've done this podcast. So agree with you on that point. Want to turn to Asia a little bit, because the Asian model is very interesting because it appears to be very government driven. Countries like China, Singapore, South Korea taking a very proactive approach with state-led strategies. So what were some of the success factors that you identified in these government-driven approaches?
Well, definitely, I would say the nations or the governments take intellectual property, or let's say research commercialization, as one of the government's priorities and strategies. And they put into place policies, but also sufficient amount of the funds and other forms of the support for universities as well, in terms of establishing maybe infrastructure in the service of innovation, and locating their ecosystem close to also businesses, such as the instances in China, and multinational corporations, and also connecting universities with businesses as well, and playing an active role in it. Another thing is also prioritizing innovation in terms of the ranking, and I would say maybe providing funding, where showcasing your previous success with innovation can be a green card, or a positive way to get additional fundings and so on. But definitely in Asian example, we can see a much more presence of government and national policies and initiatives than, for example, we can see it across the Europe or USA. So I think that's the main distincting point, but I believe Todd has more to add on this.
Yeah, look, I could probably add just another perspective, which is that in comparison with, for example, Africa and perhaps even South America to some degree, one of the things that the governments prioritize is funding towards research and development. I mean, because research and development funding is the precursors then, obviously, then to commercialization. And I think what they have done reasonably, if not particularly well, is been to link, those research and development funds, and then also to have a subsequent fund which helps the development of that research into something that can be used. So I think there's been some, as Medisa has mentioned, state-led strategies which have been particularly effective.
Now, I want to turn for a second, because you mentioned Africa, and your analysis showed emerging frameworks there that have a focus on homegrown solutions and social innovations, which we just talked about with respect to Europe and Canada. How do you see this approach addressing some of the unique challenges and opportunities that Africa as a continent faces?
Well, yeah, perhaps it's really important to start this conversation by saying that African nations differ quite markedly in
wildly.
Yes. So from that perspective, talking about Africa as a continent, even sub-Saharan Africa by itself, I mean, there's still some quite radical differences between the approaches and the resources, the context. And I think that's what I wanted to start with this conversation is when you look at, on a whole, African universities, generally their context is characterized by having a lack of resources. In this sort of a context, what that means is that you don't, I would consider commercialization to be like a higher order activity that you can do once you've got good educational systems, and then you've got, good systems around research. You've got good funding for your research. I think, then aiming for commercialization makes a whole lot of sense. But I think in the context where perhaps there is a lack of resources, I mean, you know how it is with high quality research. You need leading edge investment, facilities, and for that to be in place, cutting edge research is the source of where we're going to get intellectual property that has value, that has market value, and so from that perspective, just having the sort of resources that you would require. But I think also what we found was the less developed IP policies generally. There was a desire in Africa generally to take Bayh-Dole Act and customize it to a degree, but as I mentioned, the ability to enforce that is perhaps not as well established than that you see in developing countries. And I think then what that all leads to is that this low priority to promote and support commercialization efforts, because I guess there's other things that need the money or need the focus. And I think overall, what we saw is that where there were some efforts, it tended to be much more focused on the local context. So, for example, social innovation activities and local collaboration is tended to be prioritized over what you consider to be more sophisticated commercialization activities.
Yeah, maybe what I would add, what I really specifically liked about Africa is its social impact orientation, where I believe it's really good if you are a newcomer to this topic, like IP commercialization, and if your entrepreneurial ecosystem at university isn't so developed, the best way to start is to, observe the environment, see what kind of issues need an instant solutions, and focus on, making an impact in the environment where you are already present, where you don't have to compete globally, and where not additional extra resources are required. Because when you look at the Asia, like China, South Korea, and so on, these countries are global competitors, and comparing them with certain universities from developing or underdeveloping regions isn't fair. But countries who are newcomers and who are developing also have a lot of positive prospects, and they definitely have took certain routes from which we can learn, like homegrown solutions and focusing on the local needs and social impact that usually we see is lacking from a bigger picture where there is just a focus on global competitiveness and producing an output that can make your university or country standing on the global rankings high. So yeah, I specifically like the South Africa, and as Todd said, there are a lot of things that are missing, but at the same time, I think it's untapped potential, and I see it going into one really interesting and nice development pathway.
So you identified 7 major challenges that universities face globally, and this was everything from fragmented IP policies to the valley of death funding gap. Which of these challenges surprised you most in terms of its universality across different regions?
So, Lisa, it's a great question. And I've been around a while, so I'm not surprised by much these days. So I might let Medisa kick off this conversation, then maybe I can add something after that.
Yeah, maybe through my research and talk with the technology transfer officials working actually at infrastructures in the support of the IP at universities across the Europe, for instance. What really surprised me was that regardless of the size of the university, number of the funds and the connectedness with maybe innovation ecosystem and the network and so on, they usually experience the lack of funding in terms of the staff employment. And a lot of them actually are lesser in the size that they would love to be. They would love to expand, but universities often lack resources, and it's simply not priority, to invest in infrastructure in the support of the IP. And I think that across global, if we look at the statistics, generally, there is a lot of change in the fundings, available funding, special public fundings for universities, where universities basically in the future need to look for some kind of sustainability model for themselves. And also, as I said at the beginning, to redefine maybe their role. Another thing, maybe when you look at the IP policy, something that I'm at the moment looking across globe, coding those IP policies at institutional level and so on, is that they are pretty much rudimental. I would say they are pretty much basic, and sometimes, reality and what is on the paper and what we see in the statistics and the research outputs doesn't correlate with each other. A lot of unheard needs, mainly coming, I would say, from the staff. And as one of the things also we identified throughout the research is the need for more training opportunities, I would say lifelong learning opportunities, and generally a need for raising awareness around the importance of the IP for not just institutions, but also individuals themselves and the society.
And perhaps I can just add something on top of that, because I as I said, nothing surprising for me, but just some things that I think are still being overlooked after all these years. And I guess one of them is academic incentives. There is still a lack of recognition that, for an academic to do any of these type of activities, it's extra work. It's, they've got teaching that they have to do, set amount of teaching. They get supervision of master thesis, perhaps PhD thesis. They've got their own set of research. And then on top of that, according to, the way that academic work has been framed, there's this extra work. Now, we've got a lot of research that has identified that actually, collaborating with industry, for example, can lead to, higher impact publications and a higher number of publications. But generally, the notion is, you're taking me away from my work by doing this. And so just the lack of recognition, I think, of that, and the lack of alignment of incentives for academics, and perhaps also in line with that sort of critique, there's also a lack of recognition of the bureaucracy that is involved in this sort of process, whether it's commercialization or even just collaboration generally. We continue to hear, some of these other, obviously the valley of death and things like that, but we rarely hear, whether it's not the academics or the business partners, but actually the, people responsible for the system, policymakers, talking about the problems with bureaucracy. Now, if you ask an academic or you ask an industry partner, it's one of the first things they say. It's like, the bureaucracy is just a killer. And it's something you have to get over. So I guess there's two things from my perspective that continually seem to be overlooked in this space that I think we could do better with.
Now, I want to turn to industry engagement, because your report mentions this persistent issue of low industry engagement and trust even between academia and external stakeholders. So what were some of the most maybe effective trust building mechanisms that you found as part of your research?
Yeah, it's something that continues to come up in conversations in our studies, is the cultural gap between industry and academia, whether it's in the form of, orientation, the goals that you might have, the timelines that you work to. I mean, that's one of the most common ones, but also even just the language that is used. And I think that continues to happen. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we have a magic bullet that can solve that, but I think there's some things that we've seen that have been particularly effective. And in some ways, it's having the TTO staff or the knowledge transfer staff actually supporting new collaborations with a focus on new collaborations. And basically, it's about managing expectations on both sides. And perhaps, again, some of the good examples we've seen, maybe they've started with small collaborations or small activities where they've started to get to know each other, how each other works. They've had an alignment around common interests. They perhaps have put in place a collaboration agreement that recognises both sides, what they're looking to get out of the collaboration, so the industry partner as well as the academic partner, and perhaps even just some rules of the game. So in other words, imposing that, if an email is sent, that it gets a 48-hour response time or something like that, then it keeps, academics on track and has them, responding in an industry timeline. But also, I think, as much as anything, peer support and elevating champions in the academic sphere that do collaborate externally, I think that has been particularly effective. So, in other words, if there's somebody who's, there's is collaborating with industry or even a governmental body and has done a really successful piece of research or has provided input into a policy brief or a policy creation of a policy, something like that, that they get some recognition within the academic institutions or the university in order to be able to elevate that as an activity, but then subsequently actually having those people work as champions within the university to help to promote and also, I guess, coach a little the academics on how to do this. Maybe even a bit of translation in there and say, when a business partner says this, what they mean is. And I guess that leads to perhaps the final piece of the puzzle, which is, it's a piece of the puzzle. It's, I guess, another recommendation that we've seen that works particularly well, but is rarely used, is actually having, whether it's an academic working in an industry environment or a construct that allows someone from industry to work in the academic environment. So in other words, just temporarily working in each other's environments can really build that trust and build that understanding.
Maybe something that I would add that also closely correlates and even speaks for what Todd have just said is that having shared goals and same, vision for the future, where, for instance, we often see that academics' expectations about where their research is going in the future and industries' plans are misaligning. So, having shared common vision and goals around what to do with the research outcomes in the future, it's important, especially for innovators who are at the frontier of the bringing, something to the industry at the table. Besides shared goals, I would also say shared investment and benefits. Any relationship where somebody benefits more than the other at the start is, questionable and can produce a negative points if you cannot offer maybe the fair equities or the any kind of other monetary forms of the reward for the academics, maybe providing industry collaboration opportunities for future research and development, investments, new programs at the university, PhD supervisions, and so on. It can also be a form of compensation. But a relationship where everyone feels valued and everyone feels like they are actually benefiting from relationship is definitely set out, I would say, for the success. And of course, being transparent from the beginning, it plays out in all relationship and the one between academia and industry in particular, I would say.
It's sometimes described to us by both parties as, a successful relationship is like a marriage. And so from that perspective, just having some of the things that you would do in a marriage even means sometimes you stop work and you go out for dinner together. Well, building relationships in those ways as well. So I think that's a good construct for thinking about it.
Maybe just one more comment on this. We often hear that industry perceive academics as living in their own bubbles and speaking, the language that is not an industry language, being misunderstood in the translation process. So maybe an advice for academics would be just step out of your comfort zones and, do not be too much maybe focused on the research, learn the industry language as well, and learn how to communicate and collaborate with people outside of your profession. It really is important for a successful university business collaboration.
So, Medisa, I want to stick with you for a second. Your research focused specifically on how universities adapt their IP policies. Talk to us about some of the most common misalignments you saw between institutional policies and actual commercialization outcomes.
Well, the policies, as I said, are pretty much technical, formal piece of the paper that you should have as a kind of a guideline for your IP development processes, but definitely isn't something that universities in their everyday practice, follow so much. Of course, they have it. It's, as I said, an official institutional policy document, but the work in the practice is definitely different. The policies are usually well aligned with macro regulations, specifically national, regional, international, or, for example, in the context of the European Union laws. Where maybe we see a gaps is explaining the IP management process better, focusing not only on the patents as the main outputs or the industrial property as the main outputs, but also focusing on diverse form of the intellectual property where all researchers and academics at university can see themselves. We mentioned that social scientists and those coming from humanities are often, put aside, and when reading the IP policy, they don't even see the way how they fit in. So having maybe inclusive stakeholder engagement model in decision-making processes, in the intellectual property management processes also plays a role. And what I also see missing is maybe having some key performance indicators or, a clear set of the objectives that can be measurable. That maybe can be, and more obvious to a reader, I would say. As every piece of the institutional document, it's a pretty much formal, doesn't speak and resonates a lot to academics. And maybe, we can find a way to better translate it into the practice in a way, what this document is, how it relates to you, what you can do once you have the IP and so on. Usually, from my research and conversation with academics, they say once we have the IP, we know we have to go somewhere, but once we come to the technology transfer office, we pretty much don't know what to do, how our, IP needs to be disclosed, what is going to happen with our IP once we disclose it and so on. And basically they like the basic information, which shouldn't happen if you have a lot of these institutional guidelines and policies in the place that, especially at university environment, people refer to and, want to be aware of. But definitely, I would say that the way how the document is being implemented, is it a bottom-up or top-down approach, can determine the way. And finding the language that resonates to everyone who is the subject to the IP policy is something maybe we miss out of the current IP policies as they are.
Now, MIT, Oxford University Innovation, and Tsinghua University Science Park feature predominantly as success stories in your report. What were some of the common elements that made these institutions stand out to the two of you?
I guess one of the things that really stands out for anybody looking through the report is that they are all elite institutions. They are leading the frontiers of new research, but they're also institutions armed with resources. They've got the resources at hand that they can invest and provide support around innovation efforts. I guess what others can learn from them, I think that's probably the most important insight, is that, there's a top level commitment. So in other words, senior people within the institution, within the university are buying into innovation and saying this is important, signaling internally that this is important, but also providing support for this activity. I think also the clarity in the intellectual property handling, I think, is a real standout for these three cases in particular. But also finally, the building of a culture or a collaboration commercialization environment in which that's kind of more normal. And I think that is something that also stands out with these institutions. And we do see other examples, obviously, but we pointed out to those ones in particular because we wanted to identify the ones that were at the leading edge. But there are similar efforts that are being done right across globally and universities in all parts of the world. But particularly those points, I think, really point to why these cases are particularly successful.
Yeah, maybe also something that I would add is that those are the programs that have several elements that might, make a good training program model successful, such as, being focused on building institutional capacity in terms of the entrepreneurial skills, the mindset, and the general innovation and research commercialization. Providing different forms of the support from a basic training to the mentoring, and also, embedding learning into across disciplines and across departments. As Todd said, These are some of the programs we also found as common in the literature review. And of course, as researchers ourselves, we always need to refer to the credible references and so on. But what I really noticed is that all around the world, universities are more and more having these programs in place, and general awareness around the importance of this is being increased. And there are a lot of good case studies, examples, lighthouse stories that you can always refer to and learn from. That would be my comment. But of course, these are as well very useful and beneficial if you want to build research training models on this topic at your institution.
Now, I thought the revenue sharing model at Oxford University, where inventors can receive up to 60% of the first £72,000 in licensing revenue, was pretty generous. How important do you think these financial incentives are in driving researcher engagement?
Well, I believe, as Todd said, they can be a really motivating factor for academics, and they are a form of award and recognition for an intellectual effort and all the time and the resources put in finding out something new, some kind of a new invention, and getting to the point where you actually have something tangible. So definitely, it is an important motivating factor, but it's fair, I would say, as well, because they are researchers as first point for invention should be rewarded and should also get some kind of financial compensation for their work. Of course, institution as well, since they are using the resources and the institutions' opportunities. When it comes to the revenue sharing policies, they're not fixed, and universities all around the world have different revenue sharing policies. Some universities are more generous than others. And what something really interesting I found out is that even if this is the official revenue sharing policy of the university, in the process it can be changed, of course, depending on the different institutional and external factors shaping the policies. But I would say that if you have one in place, it can definitely help you build trust and integrity from a researcher. It can motivate maybe innovation culture around the institution. And another thing is you don't have to use it only for the purpose of the compensation. Throughout my research, I found out that some universities, for instance, use it for the early stage funding for the spinouts. Sometimes, they don't take it or they don't give it to inventor, but they give them other form of compensations. But having a revenue sharing policy in place and having any form of compensation for investors is definitely mandatory, in my opinion. And it's one of the main motivating factors for why people disclose innovation and why they continue to be so innovative.
Yeah, our experience is that academics are incentivized in a number of different ways. And as Medisa alluded to, this financial recognition is one of them. And it taps into either, one of the things that academics like to do is to be recognized for their work. So that it does, does tap into that part. It also taps into rewards, which is another thing that academics are often looking to get from what they do. So in other words, they get something for having done that. There's also the solving a puzzle issue, which often academics are interested in, this complex thing that we need to solve. And I thought this particular example was quite intuitive, because I think one of the hardest things to do is to get academics to do something apart from research and education. So in other words, they need something that's worth pursuing. And I thought that the way that they structured this particular deal was quite interesting from that perspective, because it created a really compelling case for an academic to actually think, well, this seems to be worth it. If this works or if this goes ahead, then, the returns, maybe not to me personally, but at least to our research center, or, gives us the capability of doing further research. So from that perspective, I thought it was interesting the way that they constructed this, because it really tapped into these academic motivations and was enough of a motivation for academics to want to do it.
So Todd, sticking with you for a second, you mentioned the importance of ecosystem approaches rather than just focusing on volume. Can you elaborate on what this ecosystem thinking looks like in actual practice?
Yeah, look, maybe I'll just start with a specific example. We have worked quite closely with Siemens, and particularly the former head of university relations. And I guess their journey over the last 20 years has really probably emphasized something I can really pick up and use as an example as to why this is the case. What they noticed over the last 15 years or so is that there was increasingly a migration away from one-to-one collaborations and much more into many to many. And what they had noticed is, yes, of course, there's still specific research projects where there are one-to-one, but actually the big, chunky, challenging problems that we're trying to solve in research are often at a meta level, like a higher level. And so from that perspective, what that means is that you want to involve different disciplines. You want to involve different actors. So whether it's in industry partners, or it's multiple universities, or if it could even be startups. And so from that perspective, I think this example that I'm using, which is Siemens Research and Innovation Ecosystem program that they've developed, and they have 16 of these ecosystems that they've identified. I think this is a really good example of why we've moved a little bit away from this one-to-one. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just that some of the problems that we need to solve are quite complex, and from that perspective, we're going to have multiple partners on both sides. Perhaps I can give you another example, which is probably the worst named project I've ever heard, which is called Amira P260. It's pretty ordinary. It's based out of South Australia, which is my home state. And what I thought they did remarkably well was that they actually engaged in the research, supply chains around minerals and mining, and it was focused on mineral processing. And what they did is they had 3 to 4 year project timelines, which allowed for blue sky research to be done, but also they captured within that, other forms of research. So whether it was problem solving research, or if it's applied research, or even going to a mine site, was all part of this project construction that they created. But the key part was that each iteration was around a specific topic, but there was always 2 or 3 mining companies, like large mining companies, involved. There were probably 5 to 10 small to medium-sized enterprises that were involved. There were usually a research institution or two, as well as a university or two, involved in these projects. And I think it's a really productive structure for designing the project, but the primary reason is that some of the difficult projects that they were trying to bring into being required different ways of thinking, multiple partners, in fact, the entire supply chain. And so from that perspective, I think that's what we're seeing globally, is that there is a recognition that these sort of research partnerships can happen in ecosystems. And as I mentioned, Siemens have recognised that this project recognises it. And it's not to say that one-to-one collaboration doesn't still exist, but it's basically recognising that open innovation is a thing, and it is now being done in ecosystem partners.
Now, your recommendations span national, institutional, as well as individual levels. Let's start with policymakers. What's the single most important change that you think national governments should prioritize?
I would say prioritize research commercialization as something of societal value and something that can really help your future, and put into place incentives for universities to actually make this possible in the practice. For instance, all around the world, we know that universities are expected to fulfill their third mission, and they commit to it, but there is usually a lack of support. And universities are put sometimes into place where they have to focus on, bureaucratic issues, financial issues, accreditation issues, promotion issues, rather than creating an impact for the future. So prioritize it in the law, but also put sufficient amount of the funding and other forms of the support for universities to actually make all this work in the reality. And one of the things in particular I would say is provide support for infrastructure development and staff deployment as well. Because many universities would do much more if they could employ more people, but simply they, lack the funding. And as someone said, if you are in this for the money, you won't get it. This topic isn't, for the money. This is for the society and the future impacted and the impact that fix the issues around us that we have in the society.
And I think one thing that I would probably say just to bring all that together is that I think governments need to decide what they want. That is often an issue. Do you want collaboration, commercialization, valorisation? Do you want all of it? And as Medisa said, then aligning the resources that you're providing with those different pathways that you're trying to encourage and make sure that there's enough incentive for both the universities and the academics and obviously industry partners or governmental partners to want to be involved.
So for university leaders who might be listening to this podcast today, what would you say would be one concrete step they could take tomorrow to improve their institution's IP commercialization effectiveness?
Well, that is a challenging question you're proposing there. One thing that getting Medisa or I to stop at one thing is always very difficult. We usually want to take three, but if I had to land on one thing, I would say, please, as the leader of an institution, do a mystery shopper exercise where you actually act as an academic or a business partner, industry partner, or even governmental partner, trying to collaborate or trying to commercialize research. You will be shocked just how difficult, complex it is, how time-consuming it is. And then you'll do something about it. That would be my hope, at least.
It's a great suggestion.
Maybe I would say move a focus from publications and rewarding academics in their career trajectories through publications and focus on research commercialization, actually, and outputs they can create out of their research rather than many forms of the outputs rather than just publication. And one thing that I really notice is that I think young researchers and academics are more and more seeing the nonsense of having so many publications in the place, and they see a plethora of opportunities outside of the publication. I mean, the research excellence and quality of the research is foundation for the IP, but publication is not the only form that IP should take.
So the report also emphasizes that outcomes shouldn't be measured solely by patents and spin-off, which I think we've been alluding to a lot during this conversation today. Talk about some alternative metrics you think institutions should be tracking to capture broader impact. And I hear this all the time about, what other things should we be tracking instead of, just patents and spin-offs?
Well, definitely anything that can take a form of definitely IP, because the IP is a main quorum, I would say, or the form we are discussing here, but any know-how and any activity where you are creating the outputs and, presenting them to the diverse groups. It can be, for instance, the podcast episode, as we are doing right now, any kind of the policy document, the brief, maybe the workshops. And this is redefining metrics is really important, particularly for the social scientists and those coming from humanities. Simply, they cannot produce the patents and the spinouts. I mean, the spinouts are becoming more and more popular because, as you have said in the beginning of the episode, we are now focusing on the social innovation as well, where the input from those coming from social sciences and humanities is mandatory. But observe the environment and see what all departments are doing, and provide an opportunity for everyone to claim some kind of invention and, the form. There are a lot of things that are being produced that then they don't see the daylight because simply they are not industrial property and they are not being defined under the law. But I think this is also the changing as with increase of the technology and the new forms of the information being disclosed and collected, especially for instance with the softwares or the codes and so on. The debate around what IP is and how it's being protected is also being in the place. But in general, observe the environment, see what outputs your researchers and academics are producing, and find a place and forum for everyone to disclose their invention and reward it. Being a patent or being a simple workshop or a podcast as we are doing, it creates the value. Maybe not economic one, but definitely it has a value.
One thing I think our research has shown really clearly is that 9 out of 10 academics would like to create some value of their research. It's interesting that it's 9 out of 10, not 10 out of 10, but still, there's always one academic who's kind of like, But 9 out of 10 would actually like to see their research in practice and being used in some way. What we found is that 6 out of 10 actually collaborate external to academia, so not just academic partners, but actually with governmental, societal, or industry partners. 3 out of 10 specifically collaborate with industry, and then 1 of 10 will commercialization particular activities. So I guess when you go through those statistics, what it indicates to you is that if you're just collecting information about startups and licenses, you're really only gathering a small percentage of impact-making activity that an academic is undertaking. And by not recognizing all those other forms, what you're doing is you're missing out on the full impact that a university is actually making or an academic's actually making. And the other thing is that you're also de-incentivizing in some ways some of the other activities that the academics are actually undertaking. And so from that perspective, I think it's having a shift away from just capturing the small amount of activities that are coming out in the commercialization process and recognizing a broader picture. But then secondly, also understanding that this is kind of like a performance management system, the entire thing, and that, it might take 20 years before, a research project ends up in, a product or service. And so from that perspective, also understanding that there's a productive set of inputs that go into this process and are trying to identify what they might be, but also, that, as Medisa mentioned previously, the outputs, the outcomes, and then also the impacts. So understanding that it's a full ecosystem or a sort of full picture that we want to try and capture. And if we can capture some broader set of metrics and indicators, then I think for the university it's good. I think for the academic it's good. And I think we can tell a much more compelling story about the impacts that we're having.
Now, Medisa, your research looks at current trends and future recommendations. I'm curious what emerging trends in IP management you're most excited about.
Well, definitely there are many of them. And all of them really seem very exciting because they seem to be determining for the future of universities. One of them, for instance, is where future funding lays and what are our priorities in terms of the funding, what kind of research we are funding. And more we see that actually governments and the public and the private funding goes into certain areas of the research development where the gap between disciplines is more bigger than it was maybe ever before. I would also say that another thing that can determine the future trends are geopolitical changes, tensions, economical changes, tensions, market changes. Because when we speak about this topic, we usually, look from the institutional perspective. But to really properly understand the topic, you have to, as Todd said, take a multi-layered perspective and to analyze holistically all this topic. Also, I would say that the increase in the artificial intelligence and generally technology development is affecting the IP management as well from IP management side, like, completing certain tasks such as the IP scouting and, determining the technology readiness levels and so on. We see the use of AI in these ways, but also the AI doesn't only help technology transfer offices, in terms of the time management and the work efficiency. It also imposes risks such as the research ethics, safety, data protection risks, and so on. A lot of these things combine together, and I think that one of the most exciting thing would be for the end as well, that general awareness around this topic is increasing, and all around the world, academics, researchers, and innovation managers are being aware of all these challenges and the things we have been discussing. And there is, I would say, the global debate going on. And we are, having more resources now and understanding that than we had 20 years ago. And we really did some amazing stuff. So I believe that in the next 20 years, a lot of additional productive things will be, implemented and created within younger generations who have maybe different understanding of what outputs are and what academic culture actually is about.
Now, the report also mentions the need for universities to de-risk deep tech innovation and promote hybrid skilled teams. How do you see the role of university IP management evolving in the next decade?
Well, I guess one of the key findings of the report was that, and you mentioned it previously, it was about, operating in ecosystems or communities. And I think until now, and what we mean by de-risking deep tech innovation is instead of it being on the shoulders of one academic, or it's instead of it being, the responsibility of the technology transfer office, it's actually creating a broader context in which that, research can be productively brought to the market. And I think what I'm referring to here is actually having a broader set of people who are involved in this process. So in other words, the university can be acting as an ecosystem builder or a home base for a region, as a launch pad for various ventures, whether they're startups or spinouts. And once you start to, accept that you're taking this innovation role in a broader context, then actually getting deep tech innovation through that process becomes somewhat easier. Because let me give you a concrete example. If you have a professor who's, got a set of research, but either doesn't have the time or doesn't have the skill to take this forward into a spin out, then perhaps this remains on the shelf. Nothing's done with it. But if you have a context in which, you have entrepreneurs who are working together with the university, they understand each engineering, maybe they've come out of the engineering school, but they haven't been lost to the university. They're still, involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem or the innovation ecosystem. There's some research coming from that professor. Oh, he used to supervise my PhD, or my master thesis or whatever. Oh, we had a good relationship. Oh, perhaps this is something that we could work together, and maybe you could be the CEO and he remains in research, and you could take this forward. And I've got a really concrete example of that at Flinders University, which is in Australia, where that exact example happened. And I think having a broader context in which, innovation happens and the university as a central part to that. And then within that, the deep tech or the really complex research is in some ways de-risked. And I think that's, it's also another example I could use is the UT Health at San Antonio. And they are creating, for example, studios in which the research comes in, or the research, the academic, for example, comes in, might have one research project, might have multiple, but they work together with local entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs from within the university in order to develop this. And it has a support structure and a support function, has some training that's put to it and things like that. And there's more and more of these programs actually occurring within universities, and also national programs that are also supporting these types of activities.
Maybe what I would add is that I think there is a growing focus also on having interdisciplinary team with interdisciplinary skills and abilities, to blend different disciplines and languages, as we said, coming from industry, but also academia. And usually those people working in the support of the IP commercialization actually comes either from academia and industry or vice versa. They shift between academia and industry, and they speak both languages, and they are able actually to communicate well with academics and industry both. Besides having these interdisciplinary skills, we also see an increase of focused, support for social sciences and humanities than applied sciences, where you have innovation managers only for life sciences, for instance, and then innovation managers for social sciences. I would also say that, teaching the storytelling, dissemination of the research results, collaboration, communication with the wider audiences, not just, of course, with investors or those who are direct users of our research is also really important. And, the technology transfer offices, I think in the next 20 years will not look as they're looking right now, because right now they're in the service of technology transfer, mainly patents and the spinouts, and, gaining the revenue from the licensing and the sharing. While in the future, as the statistics prove, these are not sustainable, and the outputs are remaining low, and the focus will probably shift towards something that is inclusive, that is open for everyone working at the university, and that is more connected to the outside world than to the inside world, and more or less maybe certain industry areas where you have the most competitive advantage. And I would say maybe also that universities now are having more responsibilities than ever. It can look quite overwhelming, but at the same time, maybe it's a good point where we should reflect on our role in the last 20 years and see where we are heading towards the future.
Well, given that, Medisa, looking across all the 5 regions that the two of you studied, which region or approach do you think is best positioned for the future for the reasons you just gave, and why?
I would say potentially China. Why China? I guess, again, just recognizing that commercialization is the result of investment in R&D and a committed investment at a governmental level, and a widespread recognition that this R&D infrastructure is needed, the commitment is needed, the investment and funds are needed to fund cutting-edge research, combined with an industry appetite for innovation, for research. And I think that we see that coming together in China quite effectively. And as I said, the investment in the research, but also the industry side interest in the research, because they're seeing that creates a competitive advantage for them on a global scale. And so that recognition that research can actually do something, can create this competitive advantage, I think makes the case for China quite compelling.
I wouldn't prioritize any region, because certainly I believe that future is uncertain, and we see sudden global shifts and the changes depending on popular or unpopular decisions that maybe our government leaders are making. So, but I would also say that we shouldn't look only on the outputs that we have been discussing at the beginning. We should take a broader picture, and maybe certain countries are doing good in the terms of the innovation outputs, but not so maybe the protection of the labor rights or talent attraction, or general creating a social impact in the society that, as Todd have been said, have different metrics of the success. But I would maybe say that we should definitely learn from good practices, that each country has something unique to offer, something maybe universal as well. What I also noticed that we have been copy-pasting a lot Bayh-Dole Act in the last 20 years. It worked well, but maybe now is the time that we focus on our regional advantages and on what works in our institutional setting and regional setting as well. Because as Todd said, usually the IP depends on the innovation ecosystem and connectedness to the regional environment and maybe the institutional culture as well. So learn from good practices, but see what works in your own context.
So I wanted to ask the two of you, for our autumn listeners who are working in tech transfer offices, what's your advice for navigating the cultural and institutional barriers you identify in your report?
I think the first thing to recognize is that both if we're talking about industry or we're talking about academia, they can't have the same motivations, and we don't want them to have the same motivations. And I think sometimes I hear comments about, academics need to, and industry almost need to, and it keeps being this conversation of they need to be different, when in fact, I think there needs to be a recognition that academic partners are there to create cutting edge research. And on the other side, I think the recognition that, industry partners are there to work together with those researchers, even combine and bring in their own researchers to create something that is going to be useful for society. So I think it's an understanding that on both sides there is value, and that they do have different interests, and sometimes it can be a bit depressing, knowing that one's interested in this and one's interested. How do we bring this together? Well, inevitably that is the role of the technology transfer officer, is to support bringing together their apparently disparate goals into a common vision and supporting that. And I guess if I had to provide a focus of that and maybe bring it into a sentence, and it's to look to build relationships rather than transactions. Because if you build effective relationships between academia and industry, then the transactions happen. And I think sometimes I think we get caught up in but you're required to do this. This is what the intellectual property law says, and of course that can be important at times. But I think just focusing on the development of relationships would be particularly effective.
Well, I would also say do regular checkups, and have a short, long, medium term, and long term plans, and institutional metrics to measure the success and the achievement of the objectives you set out, and be connected to people who are actually working in your institution. Have a inclusive stakeholder engagement model where everyone's voice counts. If the IP policy is being implemented by the IP managers, then it would be fair that they are participating in decision-making processes, in the drafting process as well. If the academics are the one who are bringing the research for a disclosure and being the most crucial, I would say, in this process, then addressing their needs and providing incentives, creating the environment where everyone feels happy and satisfied and motivated to actually produce more and to fix issues rather than, ignore the problems or create more issues. That would be really nice. I think, being open, listening to the needs, and making people feel listened and valued and included in decision-making processes, it can help you have a strong and good leadership, but at the same time, it can help you, avoid future uncertainty and challenges you might face before.
Now, the study shows that clear, well-structured IP policies correlate with stronger commercialization outcomes. So what do the two of you think are some of the essential elements that every university IP policy should include?
Well, definitely having the IP policy in place as an institutional guide, defining what IP is, what form of IP are, who is responsible for what are your rights and obligations as an inventor, what are the rights and obligations of those who are handling the protection of the IP and the IP management. My experience till now with coding these IP policies and analyzing them is that maybe there should be a bit more focus on, key objectives, how we measure them, what we want to achieve, maybe also what kind of IP management approaches we can take, and how we can make the job easier for the IP managers. But of course, as I said, the IP policy is a starting point. There are a lot of supporting guidelines that support the IP policy, manuals, and so on. Having the IP policy is a good thing, but besides that, also having a unified approaches towards the IP management, having collections, the guidelines, having a communication and connection with the experts in the field, revising the IP policy regularly every 6 months to 1 year, we found out to be very useful, at least in the context of the European universities. Relying on an opinion of institutional but also external experts always works. but observing the environment and development as well. For instance, now with the rise of the technology and, the use of artificial intelligence in the different fields, definitely, the IP policies have to be revised and, need to adapt to the changes in the environment, but also in the institutional context as well. But as I said, they are a piece of the paper. They're not, the most important element, but they're not, of course, something that we should neglect. It's definitely something that can help us guide the process more easier.
And my background compared with Medisa's background is going to become obvious in our answers because Medisa has a legal background. I have a marketing background. So my answer is that IP policy should incentivize both academics and industry to use it rather than run from it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great comment. Yeah, thank you. And I want to turn to something, Medisa, you've talked about before, which was researcher training and IP awareness, because your report emphasizes how important that is. Talk to us about some of the most effective training models you've encountered.
Well, some of them, of course, you mentioned, such as those coming from the MIT, Oxford University, and so on, but those are globally the new and well-known practices and the training models, and definitely the one we can refer to. But I would say that, any kind of a training program that raises awareness around the importance of the IP and what kind of benefits it has for an individual researchers and their future career trajectories is a useful one. And it's something that universities should definitely implement. Besides, providing training programs on the IP awareness, I would say also, providing the training programs on how to protect the IP and how to commercialize the IP and how to communicate your IP to the audiences. It's also very useful. And what also proved to work is, having these trainings in a place for early stage career researchers and academics. Setting them out for a future career success at early stages is really important, because once we adapt maybe to certain academic mindset, it's really hard to, decode our brains. And we believe that, this might be the best way that things work out. And we might, act hesitantly towards those who are trying to explain us from technology transfer offices why we should protect or commercialize the IP. But yeah, having the research training in a place, especially for the early stage researchers and academics, is really important. And any kind of activity around increasing the awareness and importance of the IP, either being a workshop or, short courses, seminars, guest lectures, it really is very useful and something that more and more we see around the higher educational institutions.
And maybe if I could just emphasize what one thing Medisa said, which is around early stage researchers. Our research overwhelmingly shows that if you get an early stage researcher to collaborate initially with industry, then they will continue to do it. 95% of them continue to do it. So if you can get them early before they're so-called institutionalized within the university context. But I just want to add one other thing is that in a broader context in which Medisa has given her answer, I would just like to say that also with planning out these activities, I think leaders shouldn't expect a training session, one-off training session, to be a magic bullet to solve this or to create commercialization activities. Usually these training activities occur in a broader context of, an environment that incentivizes academics and industry partners to work together, and also incentivizes them to want to bring their research into market or into a productive social setting.
Now, I have a really difficult question for the two of you, and that is, if you could implement one change globally, and like I said, this is a tough question, one change globally that would have the most significant impact on university IP commercialization, what would that be? And I know people can't see it, but they're staring at me like, oh my God, what kind of question is that?
It is a challenging question for sure. Maybe I'll start with something perhaps controversial. If I could change one thing globally, it would be that all academics who are awarded a professor title or tenure have worked for 6 months either in industry, in government, or in a social context, at least 6 months. Our research shows that if as little as 6 months can prove a difference in terms of the way they think, the way that they approach, creating impact or collaboration. And so that's probably the controversial thing I'd say is all academics need to work somewhere else for 6 months before they get accepted to become a professor. And of course, conversely, we should have more positions for professionals to come into the university and be adjunct or play other roles, because I think just being in each other's environments, that's, I guess, the message is that they understand each other better and it's much easier to work together.
Maybe something that comes to my mind that I wouldn't necessarily implement, but just, is spiraling around my head as an idea is having each academic researcher working on their spin-out idea, like from, having a concrete business idea to implementing the actual plan, while seeing all these different elements, of the progress and the work that every day innovation managers and those working in the IP management and commercialization actually are undertaking, so they can better understand the complexity of the process and better understand that, the research outputs is on the paper, but it really is a long, long path towards getting either a patent form or a spin-out form or, finding the place in the outside world, and that it's not so easy as you might, think. And something that really I got as a feedback from at least innovation managers in the Europe is not everything you write down is, good idea and can be patented or, can find a purpose in the society. And sometimes we are just, too stick to our research ideas thinking that they will change the world, while in reality, it's not as such.
Now, Todd and Medisa, as the podcast comes to a close, I wanted to ask the two of you, what surprised you the most during all this research? Something that maybe challenged your assumptions about how university IP commercialization works around the world?
Maybe what surprised me is that how regions are not different, how they actually are similar, in a sense that, you can have some things in the place, but at the same time miss the other. And if one thing is missing from the picture, the picture might not look so nice and appealing. So I think that there are more similarities than differences. Of course, there are obvious differences, but as I said, regardless maybe of the size, the position, competitive advantage, even the biggest and the most successful in this area really struggle with some of the most basic things, such as, the funding for the staff and, using maybe, efficiently the time and focusing on how to measure the impact.
For me, I guess the thing that was most surprising in some ways is that that we, as globally, we continue to look back at the US, at what the US is doing, and I think the Bayh-Dole Act plays that role, I guess, globally for universities when it comes to commercialization. We see and hear continually the mention of Bayh-Dole. Have you got your own Bayh-Dole? It's really, that sort of a conversation. It keeps coming up. And I guess what's surprising about that to a degree is that it misses the context in which the university is. And so from that perspective, understanding that context actually does matter, where your university is, what it is as an institution, it really does play a role in the sort of intellectual property that rules, regulations that you might adopt. And too often, I think there was there's almost like a one-for-one desire to bring a Bayh-Dole Act in. And it's not to say it's not a fantastic piece of policy that's been created. It's just to say that in doing so, it misses the localized context. And in fact, the question even doesn't get asked, which is, what is it we're trying to encourage here? And so from that perspective, I think that's probably the most surprising thing. Maybe one other thing was surprising was that nobody has done this study before. we were continually surprised that I said to Medisa, surely somebody's done something like this before. Haven't you found something? No, nothing. So I think that was also surprising for us.
Well, Thank you both so much for all your time today. The report is incredible. And like you said, there's nothing else quite like that. Really appreciate you taking all this time today to walk us through the report and all your insights. This really has been fantastic.
Well, thank you for inviting us, Lisa, and also congratulations on the amount of episodes that you've had over the years. It's a really important contribution you're making. So thank you for inviting us to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you. I hope your audience will like the podcast.
Thank you both so much again. That brings us to the end of today's episode with Todd and Medisa. Their UIIN Insights Brief, Unlocking University IP, Global Insights into Commercialization Challenges and Opportunities, represents one of the most comprehensive comparative analysis of university IP frameworks ever undertaken, spanning 5 global regions and offering actionable recommendations for policymakers, university leaders, and tech transfer professionals. The full UIIN Insights Brief is available through the University Industry Innovation Network, and we encourage our listeners to delve deeper into the regional case studies and detailed recommendations compiled by Todd and Medisa. Thank you for joining us on Autumn on the Air. Until next time, keep innovating and transferring technology that makes our world a better place.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.